She stole all our money, but they wanted to put us in prison for it. I never thought I'd hear myself say something like that. Family is supposed to mean trust, loyalty, a bond that lasts no matter what. But the night my daughter got married, I learned that sometimes the sharpest knives don't come from strangers in dark alleys. They come from people who share your blood. Let me rewind. My name is David Carter. I'm 54 years old, a project manager for a construction firm here in Des Moines, Iowa. I've always lived a practical life. Modest two-story house, a mortgage that still has 10 years left, a Toyota Tacoma that's already showing rust along the fenders, and a wife, Susan, who's held this family together for more than 3 decades. We're not rich people. We're not the kind who could just write a check for a wedding and smile. When our daughter, Emily, told us she was getting married, Susan and I felt both joy and fear. Joy because we loved her fiancé, Matthew, and fear because we knew what weddings cost. You hear people talk about $30,000 weddings, $50,000 weddings, and you think, that's insane. But once you start booking venues, caterers, photographers, it's like falling into quicksand. Every yes pulls you deeper. So we made a decision. We applied for a personal loan at Wells Fargo. No collateral, just our signatures and the promise we'd pay it back. $40,000. The banker looked me in the eye and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. This will make a day your daughter will never forget." I smiled, but inside my stomach twisted. I knew that money wasn't ours. We were borrowing tomorrow's peace for one day of happiness. Our plan was simple. Weddings bring gifts, and in our family, gifts mean envelopes with cash. Between relatives, friends, and colleagues, we expected enough to cover most of the loan. We'd pay the bank, and Emily and Matthew could start their lives debt-free. Risky? Sure, but it felt worth it. And then came the twist. My sister, Linda. Linda was always the wild one of the family. Younger than me by 7 years, she'd bounced from job to job, city to city. She lived in Chicago for a while, then Kansas City, then back here in Iowa when things didn't work out. She always had stories about big opportunities and new beginnings, but those beginnings usually ended in unpaid bills and borrowed money she never returned. Still, she was family. When she asked if she could come to Emily's wedding, Susan hesitated, but I said yes. It's my sister, I told her. It's one day. Let's give her a chance to be part of this memory. And so, Linda arrived the day before the wedding. She hugged Emily like she was the proudest and alive. She clinked glasses with Susan at rehearsal dinner. She even slipped me a sly smile, like she knew we'd made the right choice to include her. I wanted to believe her. The wedding itself? Perfect. A rented ballroom downtown, decorated with white lilies and fairy lights. Emily in her lace gown, Matthew in a sharp navy suit. Susan cried through the vows. Guests filled the tables with laughter and stories. The band played late into the night, and for a few precious hours, everything felt right. We had a special chest, a polished wooden box with a lock, set on a table near the entrance. Guests dropped their envelopes in as they arrived. By the end of the night, the chest was heavy. I remember carrying it to our room, my arms straining, my mind buzzing with relief. That money wasn't just paper. It was the key to paying off our loan, to avoiding years of debt. After the last dance, after the last toast, we went upstairs to sleep, exhausted, happy, and maybe a little drunk from champagne. We set the chest in the corner of the room and shut the door. I didn't even bother to lock it. Who would? We were surrounded by family, by love. But in the morning, when Susan went to check, her scream cut through the quiet. The chest was open, empty. Every envelope was gone. I froze. My first thought was that someone moved it. Maybe Matthew's family had taken it for safekeeping. Maybe it was a prank. But no, it was gone. All of it. The horror that spread through that room is something I'll never forget. My daughter's face drained of color. Matthew's hands shaking as he called the manager. Susan clutching her chest like she couldn't breathe. And me. I felt 54 years of trust crumble in a single heartbeat. We called the police. They took statements, dusted for prints, wrote reports. They promised to investigate, but they also reminded us that theft at weddings was not uncommon. Sometimes it's staff. Sometimes it's distant relatives. Sometimes it's no one you'd expect. But the bank didn't care. To them, none of this mattered. The loan was ours. The money was gone. And now, the first payment was due in 30 days. That's when the nightmare truly began. The police left that morning with polite but empty promises. "We'll be in touch," one of them said, scribbling in his notebook. But I could see it in his eyes. Another theft, another file in a cabinet, another case that might never be solved. Susan sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the corner where the chest had been, her lips pressed so tight they were almost white. Emily tried to comfort her, but she was trembling herself, as though the wedding dress she wore just yesterday had turned to ashes overnight. Matthew paced, fists clenched, muttering that maybe one of his groomsmen had seen something. Everyone was searching for someone to blame. And me? I tried to keep calm, tried to be the anchor, but inside, panic clawed at me. $40,000. Not monopoly money. Not a figure we could laugh off. Real debt, with real collectors waiting. The first week was the worst. Every day, I went to work, but my mind wasn't on blueprints or deadlines. It was on numbers. How much we owed. How much we could scrape together. How long before the bank started breathing down our necks. On the 7th day, the letter arrived. Payment due, $1,050. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the bold numbers on the page. The house smelled of coffee. The radio played some cheerful country tune, but all I could hear was the weight of that debt pressing down on my chest. We paid the first installment from our savings. It felt like throwing a bucket of water at a wildfire. Pointless, unsustainable. And then came the whispers. Relatives started asking questions. Didn't you have a gift box? I thought we saw envelopes. What happened to all the cash? We kept quiet. Susan begged me not to spread it around. People will think Emily's wedding was cursed, she whispered at night, or that we were careless. So we smiled in public, pretended everything was fine. But behind closed doors, tension grew like mold. The second week, a call came from a bank. A man named Mr. Hamilton, his voice calm but cold. "Mr. Carter, we noticed the payment was late. It's been 7 days." I protested. "We sent the check." "Yes, but you must understand, with unsecured loans, punctuality is everything. If this continues, your credit standing will be at risk." I hung up, my hand shaking. Susan looked at me from across the kitchen table, eyes wide. "What did they say?" "They want their money," I muttered. "They don't care what happened." And that was the truth. To them, it didn't matter if the money was stolen by strangers or if it evaporated into thin air. They lent it to us. We owed it. By the third week, suspicion began to creep into our minds. Not strangers, not staff, someone closer. I replayed the night in my head. Who had been near the chest? Who lingered by the entrance? Faces blurred together, laughter turning sinister in my memory. But one image kept returning. Linda, my sister. I remembered how she'd hovered near the gift table earlier in the evening, joking with guests, sipping her wine. I remembered how she disappeared midway through the reception, claiming she needed fresh air. I remember her smirk the next morning, casual, almost too casual, as if she knew something the rest of the U.S. didn't. I didn't want to believe it. Family doesn't do that, not to their own. But the thought wouldn't leave me. Susan noticed my silence one night. "You think it was her," she said flatly. I didn't answer. "She's your sister, David. You vouched for her. You said she deserved to be here." Her words cut deeper than any accusation. Because she was right. I had opened the door. By the 4th week, our situation worsened. Another letter, harsher this time. Final notice before default. And with it, a threat. If we fail to pay, the bank will pursue legal action. I called them desperate. We were robbed. We filed a police report. "Can't you give us more time?" The woman on the line was polite, almost sympathetic, but firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter. Without collateral, there's no flexibility. Payments must be made on time." I slammed the phone down, the sound echoing through the kitchen. Susan flinched. Emily burst into tears. "Matthew, pale and helpless, muttered something about getting a second job, but his voice cracked like glass. We were drowning, and then came the unthinkable. One morning, as we sat at breakfast, a letter slid through the mail slot, not from the bank, from a law office, a formal notice of potential foreclosure proceedings. Susan gasped, her hand shaking so violently she spilled her coffee. Emily grabbed the letter, her face pale as she read. They're threatening to take the house? I nodded, unable to speak. We had 1 month, 30 days to come up with the missing money, or we'd lose the home we'd built our lives in. And the cruelest twist? Rumors spread in the family that maybe we'd staged the theft ourselves, that we'd pocketed the money and were pretending to be victims. I sat in my truck one night, staring at the dashboard, and felt something inside me break. I had trusted my sister. I had trusted the system. And now, not only were we facing ruin, but people were starting to look at us like criminals. But then, something happened that changed everything. Something that turned suspicion into certainty. And it started with a single overheard conversation. The conversation I overheard didn't come from a shadowy alley or a tap phone. It happened in the most ordinary place in town, the pharmacy on Maple. I was standing in line with a pack of paper towels and antacids. 2 things I've been going through too fast, when I heard Linda's voice from the greeting card aisle. "I told you, it'll cover few things," she hissed into her phone. "No, I can't use that account. They're watching it. I'll bring cash." My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick right there by the mints. I couldn't see who she was talking to, only the way she kept her back turned, as if the shelves were a wall. She paid for a sympathy card and a lottery ticket, of all ironies, then headed out without noticing me. The cashier asked if I wanted my receipt. I nodded and missed the door before it swung shut. At home, I said nothing to Susan until I could breathe without shaking. Then I told her exactly what I'd heard. She sat very still, hands wrapped around her mug, like it was the only warm thing left in our house. "I knew it," she whispered. "I prayed I was wrong, but I knew. We needed more than anger and a hunch. We needed proof. So I started the only way I knew, with lists, times, faces, places. I drew the floor plan of the reception from memory and marked where the gift chest sat, who stood near it, when the lights dimmed for the first dance. I called the venue and asked to speak to whoever had been in charge that night. They connected me with the event manager, a woman named Kirsten who sounded competent and tired in equal measure. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said after I explained. "We did a sweep after teardown, but nothing turned up. Do you keep logs? Anyone who signed for anything? Keys?" I asked. There was a pause, then a rustle of papers. "We do record who takes control of valuables when families ask us to move them to the office safe," she said. "But, sir, I don't want to give you false hope. Please look." 5 minutes later, she came back on, voice different now, focused. "We have a form from 11:26 p.m. Gift card chest transferred to family representative for office safe. Signature reads L. Carter." My skin prickled. "Did you check ID?" "It says ID verified." We note the type. Here it says driver's license. I closed my eyes, pictured the chest crossing the dance floor at 11:26 like a ship vanishing in fog. "Do you have cameras?" "In the lobby and loading hallway." "Yes, not in the ballroom." Another pause. "I can't release footage without a request from law enforcement, but I can tell you there's movement recorded near the office door around 11:30. If the police ask, we'll preserve it and share." I thanked her and hung up, my hand suddenly steady. We had a time, a signature, a path. Next, I called our photographer, a calm, meticulous man named Trevor, who had sent a preview gallery but not the full batch. "Trevor, I know this is an unusual request," I said, "but would you mind scanning the background of whatever you shot around 11:30? Anything that shows the gift table, the lobby, the office door, anything." He surprised me by saying, "I've actually been culling to the candid set. Let me dig. I'll call you tonight." He phoned at 9:42 p.m. "Mr. Carter, I think you'll want to see this," he said, and I could hear keys tapping. A link appeared in my inbox. Photo 372. Susan and I on the dance floor, balloons in the foreground. But in the far background, at the edge of the frame, a figure in navy chiffon lifted the lid on the white chest. Photo 376. The same figure glancing over his shoulder, then the chest lid lowered. Photo 381. A staffer in a vest speaking to her, pointing toward the lobby. Do you recognize the person? Trevor asked gently. I zoomed until the pixels protested. The face was turned 3/4 away. But the posture, the hair, the necklace I'd seen exactly once. A gold bar Linda bragged about snagging on discount, clicked into place like a lock finding its key. Yes, I said, voice rough. I do. Trevor hesitated. There's also an audio bed for my second camera. I don't usually keep the scratch track, but the mic picked up conversation near the gift table. At 11:25, a woman says, the father asked me to move this to the office. It's too exposed. A staffer answers, sure, if you'll sign the form. Then, faintly, the woman, Elsie, it's not broadcast quality, but you can hear enough. Again, I'll keep everything for the detective if needed. I put the phone on speaker, so Susan could listen. She folded over the table, like the sound took the last air from her lungs. When it ended, we sat in silence, our kitchen clock performing surgery on the seconds. We have to go back to the police, she said finally. We did. This time, the desk sergeant didn't treat us like a gust of wind. The detective we'd met before, Stevens, with the careful eyes, listened without interrupting as I laid out the timeline, the log from the venue, the photos, the audio snippet. When I mentioned a pharmacy conversation, he jotted notes. Do you have a copy of the vendor log? He asked. Kirsten at the venue said she'll provide it with a formal request. He nodded. We'll get that. We'll also ask for the lobby cam footage in the office hallway. If the signature is there, and the footage shows a removal, that's strong. Cash is hard to trace, but checks? If any were deposited, we can subpoena records. He looked up. We'll need a complete list of guests who wrote checks and to whom they were made payable. I had already started a spreadsheet. That night, I called people I loved and asked them to go through their check registers and text me photos. It took hours. It took swallowing pride the size of a brick. But by midnight, I had a list, 24 checks written to Emily and Matthew for the Emily Carter, one to the Carters. The next morning, Stevens picked up the file. While the gears turned, the pressure at home did not let up. Another notice from a bank, more pointed than the last. An email from a collection agent with phrases like acceleration clause and legal remedies. The threat to our home loomed like a storm with a date. Then the first hard piece of independent evidence landed in my inbox from Detective Stevens. A still frame from the venue's lobby camera, time stamped 11:29 and 34 seconds p.m. It showed the office door ajar, a staffer in a vest at the threshold, and a woman in navy chiffon carrying a white chest with metallic trim. Her face was slightly blurred, but the outline was unmistakable. In the next still, the office door closed. In the third, 3 minutes later, the same woman walking briskly toward the side exit with an empty luggage cart. Do you want me to confirm who you believe this is? Stevens wrote, We'll be obtaining additional footage from the side lot. I stared at the pixels until tears blurred them into rain. I forwarded the image to Susan. She replied with one line, I wish this were anyone else. The next day, Stevens called. We have a side lot camera. It's old, grainy, but at 11:37 a.m., sedan backs up to the curb. The same woman loads a chest into the trunk with the help of a man in a gray hoodie. The plates aren't readable in the night glare. We're contacting nearby businesses for better angles and any plate readers on the corridor. We also received a copy of the venue's chain of custody form. The signature is L. Carter. He paused. Mr. Carter, we've also started getting bank responses. 2 of your guest checks were deposited via mobile captured morning after the wedding into an account under the name L. Jansen. The routing goes to a prepaid debit provider. We're tracking the KYC used to open it. I gripped the counter. That's her second married name, I said softly. She kept it after the divorce. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a hinge. For the first time in a month, The truth no longer lived only in our house. It had dates, forums, cameras, and banks repeating it back. That night, I drove past Linda's apartment. The blinds were closed. A for lease sign sat in the patchy grass out front, recent enough that the corners still curled inward. I checked our family group chat. Quiet from her number. I checked social media. Her accounts had gone dark. It felt less like a vanishing act and more like a hurried curtain fall. When I got home, Susan was sitting in the living room with a stack of mail in her lap. She handed me a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper torn from a spiral notebook. 3 words in a familiar hand. I didn't mean. I stood there under the ceiling fan, the paper small and absurd in my fist, and felt a strange mixture of fury and relief. There it was. Not a confession, not an apology, but the closest thing to acknowledgement we'd likely get from her, without a badge in the room. I put the note in a plastic sleeve and slid it into the folder marked evidence on our kitchen desk. Then I turned to Susan. We're not going to lose this house, I said, not to a bank, and not to my sister's choices. She nodded through tears. So what do we do now? Now, I said, opening my laptop and pulling up the spreadsheet of checks. We helped the detectives finish what they started. The next morning, the phone rang at 8:03. Detective Stevens again, voice brisk. Mr. Carter, we've got a hit. A license plate reader 2 blocks from the venue picked up a plate linked to a gray sedan at 11:42 p.m., registered to a Leonard Jansen. Former address, same building as your sister. We're preparing a warrant. He exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for a month, too. I think we're close. The call from Detective Stevens felt like the first real crack of sunlight through a month-long storm. After weeks of chasing shadows, they finally had something hard, something that tied Linda not only to the scene, but to a getaway. A car, a name, a paper trail. But sunlight can be harsh, too. That evening, 2 unmarked cars rolled up to Linda's old apartment complex. Stevens kept me updated by phone. He didn't have to, but maybe he understood what it meant to us. They had the warrant in hand, signed by a county judge, authorizing the search of any property tied to Leonard Jansen, her on-again, off-again partner. Sir, Stevens told me, voice flat but steady, we recovered a white chest from a locked storage unit rented under Jansen's name. It contained envelopes, cards, and, well, some opened, some not. We're cataloging it now. It looks like most of the checks were already deposited, but the cash, some of it's here. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was like hearing the wedding all over again, only in reverse. The weight of the chest leaving the dance floor, then reappearing under fluorescent lights in some storage warehouse. Susan sat across from me, hand covering her mouth. Tears streaked her face, but she wasn't sobbing. She was too exhausted for that. They found it, she whispered. They found it, I repeated. But victory is rarely clean. The bank still hounded us. Notices didn't pause just because detectives had evidence. We were behind on payments, and their tone had turned brutal. Foreclosure threats, wage garnishment, lawsuits. One letter bluntly stated, absent full payment within 10 business days, legal action will proceed. I tried to argue with them, explain it was fraud, explain the money was stolen, explain we were cooperating with police. They didn't care. To them, we weren't victims. We were debtors. And then came the worst blow, a letter from the county prosecutor's office. At first, I thought it was good news, maybe an update on charges against Linda. But as I read, my stomach curdled. It was a summons. Susan was being listed not only as a witness, but as a potential subject of investigation. The theory, the prosecutor suggested, was that she might have colluded with Linda to take the money and stage a theft. I slammed the letter on the kitchen counter. They're blaming us. I spat. Susan looked pale, her hands trembling as she read the lines. How could they think that? She whispered. Because it's easier, I said bitterly. It's easier to accuse the people already under debt than to chase the one who ran. That night, I barely slept. I sat in my recliner staring at the ceiling fan, replaying every detail, the photos, the audio, the signatures. It was airtight, But airtight wasn't the same as admissible, and admissible wasn't the same as believed. The next morning, Stevens called again. "I need you and your wife down at the precinct. Bring the note you received, the copy of the guest checklist, everything. They're going to question you." We drove there in silence. Susan clutched the evidence folder like a shield. I kept my eyes on the road, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. Inside, a fluorescent-lit conference room awaited us. A prosecutor in a gray suit leafed through papers while a young assistant clicked a pen. Stephen sat in the corner, arms folded. The prosecutor looked up. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we appreciate your cooperation, but you must understand, when large sums disappear at a family wedding, we explore all angles. Right now, the angle pointing toward you is that this was an inside job." Susan's voice cracked. "You think I stole my own daughter's wedding gifts?" He shrugged. "We think it's possible you conspired with your sister. You were the ones who benefited from the credit, the loans, the reception hall. Maybe the two of you thought you could double your money." I leaned forward, slapping the folder on the table so hard the assistant flinched. "You want conspiracy? Look at the venue's log. Look at the signature. Look at the footage of her loading the chest into a car. Look at the bank deposits under her old married name. That's your conspiracy. And while you're at it, listen to the scratch track on the photographer's camera, her voice spelling out LCA for the signature. Unless Susan managed to clone herself, that's not her voice. That's Linda." Stevens finally spoke, calm but firm. "The evidence does support Mr. Carter. We have the storage unit seizure. We have the chest. We have cards unopened. I'd advise reconsidering the scope of your suspicion." The prosecutor frowned, tapping the papers. "We'll let the lab authenticate the signatures and voice. Until then, this investigation remains open." When we left the room, Susan looked like she'd aged 10 years. She gripped my arm. "What if they don't believe us? What if we lose the house before this is settled? What if—" I squeezed her hand. "One thing at a time. We're not done fighting. Not for the house. Not for our daughter. And not for the truth." That night, back at home, the phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "You should have kept quiet. This isn't over." I stared at the screen, cold washing through me. It wasn't just Linda anymore. Someone else, maybe Jansen, maybe more, was still out there, still watching, still playing. And for the first time, I realized the chest wasn't the only thing they'd stolen. They'd stolen our safety, our peace, and maybe, if we weren't careful, our future. The courthouse smelled like old wood and coffee. I never thought I'd spend so much time inside one. But by the time autumn came, it felt like a second home. Every day we filed through metal detectors, passed security guard with tired eyes, and sat in pew-like benches while lawyers barked arguments across the aisle. It wasn't just our case anymore. It was Linda's indictment, the stolen chest, the fraudulent deposits. But tangled in it all, Susan and I were dragged too, listed first as victims, then as witnesses, and for a terrifying stretch, as possible accomplices. The prosecutor's office hadn't dropped that theory overnight. For weeks, Susan lived with the weight of suspicion pressing down on her shoulders. Neighbors whispered. Even church friends avoided eye contact. "If the state thinks she's guilty," one woman muttered in the grocery store, "there must be something to it." It ate at her. She stopped gardening, stopped cooking the way she used to, even stopped calling Emma as much. Too ashamed to look her own daughter in the eye. But court has a way of dragging secrets into the light. The defense, desperate to muddy waters, argued that no one saw Linda lift the chest. They pointed to our debt, our credit application, the timing of everything. They tried to spin a story where Susan masterminded the whole theft, pinning it on Linda after the fact. Then came the exhibits. First, the forensic report on the venue signature. A handwriting expert compared the LCA scribble on the logbook against samples from Susan and Linda. Slide after slide flashed on the courtroom projector. Loops, tail slants. At the end, the expert adjusted his glasses. High probability this signature belongs to Linda Carter Allen, not Susan Carter. I heard Susan exhale, like she'd been holding her breath for months. Next came the audio analysis. That faint camera scratch track, enhanced and cleaned. On the speakers, a voice rang out, sharper now. Linda Carter Allen. LCA. There. The expert nodded, matched to the defendant's vocal profile at 97% confidence. The defense scrambled, objecting to inadmissible quality. But the judge overruled. Piece by piece, the noose shifted. Then came the storage unit evidence. Detectives rolled in the recovered chest itself. Paint chipped from its short exile in that locker. Photos of the envelopes, the open cards, the checks deposited in an account under Linda C. Allen. The jury craned their necks, murmurs rippling across the gallery. But the moment that seared itself into my memory was when Stevens testified. Calm as ever, he explained the warrant, the recovery, the trail. Then, when the defense tried to imply collusion, he leaned toward the microphone. With respect, sir, the Carters didn't orchestrate this theft. They were its victims. They've cooperated every step. This evidence doesn't point toward them. It points directly toward Ms. Allen. Susan's hand found mine under the table. For the first time in months, she smiled. But it wasn't over, because then came Linda. When she took the stand, she didn't look like the sister-in-law we remembered. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes sharp and hollow. She tried to charm the jury at first. Tears, apologies, vague stories about desperation. But soon her mask cracked. Cross-examination revealed the car rental, the false address, even text messages with Jansen boasting. They'll never see it coming. Easiest $50K I ever pulled. And then the nail, digital forensics, a subpoenaed email thread from a temporary account used to coordinate the banquet deposit. The recovery revealed not only her login, but the IP address. From the same hotel Wi-Fi she'd stayed in the night after the wedding. The courtroom was silent, except for the hum of the projector. Linda's lawyer tried to spin it as circumstantial, tried to paint us as bitter relatives. But the tide had turned. You could feel it. The jury wasn't looking at us anymore. They were looking at her. Still, victory didn't erase the scars. Even as the evidence piled up, the bank pressed its case against us. The prosecutor had never formally withdrawn Susan's name from their angle. The creditors still demanded money. We sat there day after day, as if on trial ourselves, our future hanging in the balance. And then, on the fourth week of hearings, the turning point came. The judge, after reviewing the expert testimony, finally declared from the bench, "The Carters are hereby recognized as victims in this matter, not subjects. The state will proceed against Linda Carter Allen as the sole defendant in the theft of property and fraud charges." Susan broke down sobbing right there at the table. I held her, my own throat tight, as relief thundered through me. Months of fear, suspicion, and shame finally lifted. But the war wasn't over. Linda still had her verdict ahead, and the bank still loomed. And as we left the courthouse that day, the autumn air crisp around us, I couldn't shake the question. If family could do this, what else might we not see coming? The last day of trial felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Neighbors, reporters, even strangers who had followed the scandal in the local paper. Emma sat behind us, clutching Susan's hand, her face pale but steady. I could tell she wanted this chapter closed more than anyone. The jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. The foreman stood, paper trembling slightly in his hand. On the charge of theft of property in excess of $50,000, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of identity falsification, we find the defendant guilty. The words landed like thunder. Susan gasped, and Emma squeezed her hand until her knuckles went white. I closed my eyes for just a moment, letting the sound sink into me, like a weight being lifted after carrying it too long. Linda didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She just stared straight ahead, jaw tight, as if daring the world to pity her. But the gavel came down all the same. Sentencing was set for 7 years in state prison. Justice, or at least as close as we could hope for. But our fight wasn't only in criminal court, it was financial, because the bank hadn't cared about family betrayals or jury verdicts. They cared about payments. For months, letters had piled up on our porch. Threats of foreclosure, demands for repayment, warnings of lawsuits. We had borrowed against our home, counting on the gift money to patch the hole. But when Linda stole it, we had nothing left. When the bank's lawyers argued that we were still liable, the prosecutor himself stepped in, submitting forensic evidence from the trial as proof we were victims, not perpetrators. Susan's name was formally cleared. Her status shifted from possible accomplice to injured party. That ruling opened the door. Our attorney filed a civil suit against Linda for damages. Not just the stolen gift money, but the entire cost of Emma's wedding and the mental anguish it had inflicted. For weeks, we sat through depositions, recounting the nightmare in cold, legal terms. And then, against all odds, we won. The judgment awarded full compensation for the $45,000 we'd spent on the venue, the $38,000 on catering, the $12,000 for the band, $15,000 for photography and video, $9,000 for decorations. Every last cent Susan had poured into that day. On top of it, the court recognized emotional distress and reputational damage, awarding an additional $50,000. I'll never forget the moment the judge read that number aloud. Susan covered her face with her hands and wept. Emma leaned into me, whispering, "We're finally free." It didn't make us rich. It didn't erase the months of humiliation, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing our home. But it gave us back our dignity. It proved, in writing, in law, that we hadn't deserved any of this. And the irony? For weeks, the prosecutor had pushed the theory that Susan was a co-conspirator. At one point, she was even listed as a potential defendant. But the digital forensics, emails, IP addresses, text messages, destroyed that narrative. The very devices Linda had used to steal from us became the instruments of her downfall. When the final gavel struck, I looked at Emma. She wasn't broken. She wasn't ashamed. She was strong, standing taller than I'd ever seen her. "Dad," she whispered as we walked out of the courthouse. "I thought my wedding was the worst day of my life. But now I think maybe it saved me. Better find out who he really was. Better to lose the money than to spend a lifetime trapped in his lies." I nodded, my throat tight, because she was right. We had lost money. Yes, we had lost peace of mind. But we hadn't lost her. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. As we stepped into the sunlight, I realized something else too. Justice had been done. Not because the system was perfect, but because the truth finally refused to stay buried. And that truth was enough to carry us forward.
Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are from.